Good evening. Welcome to Jazz Talk, an education program of the Center for the Performing Arts. I'm Julia, and I'm the Director of Education and Community Engagement for the Center. Tonight's program, Jazz Talk, is a program that we launched during the pandemic. Now, we're excited to get started tonight, but before we do, I want to tell you a little bit more about the center. We're going to try to pull up a slide here and show you, because I know some of you are joining us from other parts of the country. We have a beautiful campus in Carmel, Indiana, just north of Indianapolis. We have 3 venues on our campus. We have the Palladium, which is our beautiful 1,600 seat concert hall. And then across the green space, we have another building that houses 2 theaters. The Tarkington, which is our 500-seat proscenium arch theater. And then we have the studio, which is our very flexible black box theater. We also have 6 wonderful resident companies, and we present artists and performers from all over the world in multiple genres. We're very fortunate to have such a beautiful facility right here in central Indiana. Now, as I started to say, Jazz Talk really launched during the pandemic. As all performing arts venues, we had to cancel our whole season, but we didn't want to lose touch with all of our jazz patrons. So we started this program, and we had 2 wonderful hosts that talked about different topics in jazz. Well, now things are different, and we have a real live jazz series. So we're spinning Jazz Talk a little bit, and we're interviewing the artists in that series a few weeks before they're going to be performing at the center. Now, Dr. Todd Williams is still going to be our host, which we are very fortunate to have him as a friend of the center. He's going to ask some questions tonight, but I know all of you are going to have questions as well, and we want to hear those questions. So if you're joining us on Facebook, please make sure to put your questions in the comments, and we'll get to those at the end. If you're joining us over Zoom, if you put your cursor in the bottom of your screen, a little Q&A function will pop up. Type your questions in there. And please don't wait till the end of the program. Type them in anytime and we'll get to those. Now, I mentioned Dr. Todd Williams, who is our host of the program, and I want to tell you a little bit more about him. He's a sought-after saxophonist, clarinetist, flautist, and clinician. He is known for his work with the Wynton Marsalis Quintet, Septet, and the Jazz at Lincoln Center Orchestra. Todd is an assistant professor of music education at Indiana Wesleyan University, where he directs the jazz ensemble and the jazz combo. A former music director of Times Square Church in New York, he has penned a variety of contemporary gospel choral works, including the international favorite, We Proclaim Him. He has toured the world, playing at venues such as the White House, to Carnegie Hall, the Hollywood Bowl, and appeared with such artists as Harry Connick Jr., John Hendricks, Terrell Stafford, Marcus Roberts, Slide Hampton, and Christian McBride. Todd is a 4-time recipient of ASCAP's Plus Award for composers. And Chris Brubeck is a musician and Grammy-nominated composer who continues to distinguish himself as an innovative performer and composer. As an award-winning composer, he is clearly tuned into the pulse of contemporary music. John Van Ryn, music critic for the Chicago Tribune, recently called Chris a composer with a real flair for lyrical melody, a 21st century Lenny Bernstein. For over 20 years, Chris was a member of his late father's Dave Brubeck Quartet. Among other projects, he now plays bass and trombone in the Brubeck Brothers Quartet with his brother Dan on drums. Chris also performs as a soloist with orchestras and has served as an artist in residence with orchestras and college music departments across the United States. We are thrilled to have Todd Williams and Chris Brubeck with us this evening. Todd and Chris, could you join us? Turn on your cameras and unmute yourselves. And I just want to really thank Chris. Todd is in his wonderful home studio. Chris is joining us on the road in a hotel room in California. And I know your tour just launched last week in New York, so we are just thankful that you were willing to join us tonight from your hotel room.
Well, I'm very glad to be here, and I'm very impressed with you, Julia. You're great at doing this.
Well, thank you. I'm going to turn off my camera now, and I want to remind people, put your questions in there, and also don't forget to come see Chris at the Palladium on October 2nd, but I'll remind you of that once we get done. All right, Todd, take it away.
All right, Julia, thanks so much. And Chris, dude, it's so great to see you. It's so great for you to be here. Thank you for being here. I'm sure our audience will find this most insightful to learn a little bit about your life and your performing career.
Well, I've just learned a little bit about your life that I didn't know. Fighting the gospel thing, and apparently we have this ASCAP Plus Award thing in common too.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that.
Yeah,
Oh,
so we're musical brothers already, more than we knew.
That's all right. That's all right. Well, uh, I just want to give you a little plug, folks. Come out to the October 2nd show. You might find a couple of surprises there. I'm sure Chris has got some things up his sleeve. It's going to be a great show. And so, Chris, why don't we start off by just let's point to the obvious. I think for our listening audience, they probably want to know about the Brubecks as a family. How many siblings do you have, and how has each responded to having such a great contributor to jazz, such as your father? Like, I'm sure you all probably responded differently, but how did that pan out in your family?
That's a good question. The answer could take decades, but I'll try to boil it down. There are 6 Brubeck children, 5 siblings I have. Okay. And 4 of us turned out to be professional musicians, that's pretty good odds.
That's fantastic.
My oldest brother Darius started out on trumpet as a kid, but also took piano and turned into a piano player. And he leads groups. He's based in England, actually, in England and France. After having spent 25 years running the first college level jazz studies program on the whole continent of Africa. So that's
wow.
I mean, he's literally writing a book about that,
That is amazing. Whoa.
And then I had a brother, Mike, who played alto sax, but he didn't become a professional musician. He was much more into horses, which is fine because my dad started out as a cowboy, so that he sort of carried that line of things going. Then there's me. I play electric fretless bass and bass trombone and piano. And then my sister Kathy, who played flute and piano, and is musical, but got more into being a mother. And also she's very spiritual in the Christian direction of things. So that was the most important thing to her. Okay. Then my younger brother Dan, who's the drummer that's going to be playing in Carmel. He's an amazing drummer.
Yeah, I know. I've heard him play. He's fantastic, man.
It's a real style that's only his, too.
Yeah. That's right.
Then my youngest brother, Matthew, he was like, we call him the family surprise because he's born 10 years after everyone else. He turned out to be a jazz cellist, which is really rare. And wow. He also understands jazz, so he'll play a bass on his cello as well as being a solo instrument. He can be very fluid in that direction. And there's a lot of funny things about him, but on the high end, I can brag and say that he and Dave and Yo-Yo Ma did some recordings together. And Ma said, Matthew, you got to take over the cello solo parts. On the other hand, he was in this band for about 6 months. This is about 20 years ago. And he said, I'm sorry, man, I'm gonna leave this group to concentrate more on original music. And so many people you probably know say that, and then what happens? He gets invited to a session for Tom Waits, the great singer. And Tom Waits says, and someone in the session said, "Hey Matthew, there's this girl singer coming up, and she's looking to have a cello tour with us. Are you interested?" And so he says, "Okay." So that turned out to be Jewel, who's on the cover of Time magazine. Then he's the darling of all the Lilith Fair people, and he ended up on the road with Sheryl Crow for 3 years, and then quit that because he couldn't stand it anymore. Because my little brother's 6'8", he couldn't take the tour buses anymore. It's like Bela Lugosi trying to get into Danny DeVito's coffin every night when he's on the bucket. And then after he retires to go into teaching, the Dixie Chicks call him up and say, "Hey man, after their controversial record, come back on the road with us." And then he said, "That's enough, no more touring." So that shows you the range. It's kind of like the Marsalis family, in that so many of us turn out to be musicians.
For sure. Definitely. Wow, that's more than I ever knew.
Maybe more than you ever wanted to know.
No, I think it's very interesting. I'm wondering how your parents actually kind of coordinated that while I know he was touring all the time, and it must have been nonstop action, I would think, you know.
It was. I mean, my mother was a super remarkable woman in, you know, in many ways. I mean, in the way that just any son would probably talk about his mother. But on top of, you know, taking 6 kids to the lesson, I mean, we finally got to a point where a piano teacher would come to our house, you know, and just teach 6 kids in a row. You know? Looking for shortcuts. Like,
that's a pretty good gig, man.
Yeah, we were playing like football, you know, and my mom would like yell, "Chris, piano lesson," you know, and I'd run, "Damn it, I gotta play." And then after a half hour, like, Dan would run in and, like, you know, whatever. That's what it was like. But my mom is also so remarkable. You probably don't know this about her, but she's the person that started the whole idea that jazz didn't have to be played in smoky, drinky nightclubs. She started the whole idea of jazz concerts in college. That's why Dave's early record, Jazz Goes to College, Jazz Goes to Junior College.
Yeah, that's
right. She was so into it that she produced a pamphlet, you know, like how to produce a jazz concert, and would send it to these young college committees. You know, this is how you promote a jazz concert. So every time any of us plays a gig that isn't in a smoky nightclub, you can thank my mom.
That's fantastic. I want to ask you something else. In another setting, I've heard you describe your father's great legacy. And as great as that was, I know you've explored other genres of music. You've done rock, you've done classical, you've done other genres. So this is not common for most jazz musicians in terms of doing those things and then circling back around. So what do you think some of the benefits are of this type of experience in your performance history?
That's a good question. You mean my bass-backwards musical education?
No, I wouldn't call it that. I mean, I think all music has its place, you know?
Well, I mean, there was, you know, one benefit to it, and just to describe it a little bit, you know, as a kid, that in 7th grade, the Beatles hit. So I loved them. I used to think rock and roll was just so primitive and stupid. And it was. Like Louie, and, you know, Donna. Once I had a girl, her name, you know, the same. That's some like stupid stuff. That was half the rock and roll book. And then when the Beatles came out and the Beach Boys, it was like something now we're getting somewhere. And so I figured my dad had the whole jazz thing sewn up. So I didn't really want to become a jazz musician. I wanted to have very innovative rock groups. And I did. And so, but also I was in youth orchestras and stuff. And I went to a special school called Interlochen Arts Academy, where there were all these great young players. And for example, Peter Erskine, the drummer, was one of my classmates, and Bob Mitford that came in the year after I left. And, you know, some high quality kids at this private music school.
Yeah, you guys have a little scene going on, man.
And so my group up there, we cut a demo, and we caught the ear of Steve Cropper, the legendary R&B musician, and we came down to Memphis and cut a record. Eventually led to a deal with Columbia, and that we had like you know, Cissy Houston, Whitney's mom, was singing background vocals, and and Mike Brecker was sitting in on tracks. Randy Brecker produced it. You know, so we were deep in the zone of that kind of stuff, and then it kind of, due to legal shenanigans with Columbia, which I was so naive, I just didn't think they pulled the stuff that they pulled, and the band broke up, and I was kind of down and blue, and my dad said, screw that stuff, start playing jazz with me. So I said, okay, I've had enough of being on the road in 2 vans and sleeping on the side of the road, you know.
So sleeping on that cramped bus.
So anyhow, your original question was like, you know, how did this manifest? So like at one point, after the Boston Symphony had discovered my first trombone concerto, which they televised, and that was when they had this series called Evening at Pops. And there was a famous bass trombonist in that orchestra, and he just asked me casually. I'd done a jazz gig with Dave, and he said, "Hey, did you ever write anything for trombone?" You know, I wrote this concerto. I mean, I really had no idea that anyone would think it was significant or worthy or anything. And he said, "Send me a tape," and I did, playing with a youth orchestra from Connecticut. And he went nuts. He said, "Oh my God, I've got to play this." And so he ended up convincing Keith Lockhart to play it an evening at Pops, and within the next year, most of the major bass trombonists in every orchestra were using their chips, you know, to be able to play. So like suddenly it was on the map, and I kept getting asked to write things, just one thing after another, one commission after another. It was just, to me, it was like a surprise.
Oh,
and
yeah.
And what happened is that Keith came to me, he says, we're doing a special show about violinists. And we have 3 completely different kind of style players. From the classical world, we have Nadja Salerno-Sonnenberg.
Oh, wow.
We have from the jazz world, Regina Carter. And from the Irish world, we have Eileen Ivers, who was a star from Riverdance, but sounds Irish, but really came from Long Island, oddly enough.
Right, New York.
So he said, we were trying to think of who would be crazy and screwed up enough to know all those genres and so we thought of you. So then I wrote that piece called Interplay for 3 Violins and Orchestra, and that went over great. And so that's an exact example, because I didn't even mention that when I quit working with my dad to be more at home with my son, who was involved in high school sports and all that. I didn't want to be on the road all the time like my dad.
Yeah.
And I'm not, asking for weeping violins. Oh, poor Chris, his dad was always gone, but I just wanted. I didn't want to miss my son's high school thing. So then I started playing more folk music. So I had experience in all these different genres. And that's a perfect example of how it all paid off, that I just organically knew all that kind of music. And the piece worked great.
That's fantastic. I think you probably got a lot out of those experiences to just kind of be open to different things. That is most admirable. I was thinking, I want to mention to our listeners, if you have questions that you think of while we're talking here, make sure to post your questions in the chat. And when these questions are done, we're going to get some of our listener questions in there as well. So listeners, I see there's 16 of you out there in Cyberland. So go ahead and post your questions. And then at the end, Julia is going to ask you some of those. Let's go on. All right. So you were in classical, you were in jazz, you were in pop, you were in funk, rock, and then, so is that one of the reasons why you stuck with electric fretless, or was that just something you just loved the sound of electric fretless and you just like, I don't care, I'm just going for it? Like, how did you come upon that?
Well, actually, I wanted to be the first rock and roll guy that played electric fretless bass. And and for whatever it's worth, I was amongst the first. And on 48th Street, New York, is where all the music stores were. And I went up down. There was one jazz bass made by Fender that was fretless, and the other one happened to be by Rickenbacker. And for some weird reason, it had these flat wound strings that were, I can't think of the right word, but they're sort of black tape wounds, what they call them.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And you wouldn't think it makes no sense, but if you put that on a Rickenbacker and you have the right stylistic sensibility, it sounds so much like an upright that I used to do jazz festivals with my dad, and then people would come up to me and they'd see me in my gig bag and they would presume it's a guitar, and they said, who are you? I said, Chris Brubeck. Oh, who's playing bass in that group? I said, I was. And they said, what? It's worth looking. It sounds so much like an upright. So I have that same original axe, and I'm proud to say that it finally got featured in the Bass Player magazine. Like, why the hell does this bass sound like an upright bass?
Oh yeah. Wow. You should talk to the people at Rickenbacker about that. Maybe they'll get you a new one. Who knows?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I think it has to be an old funky weird one.
Wow. Okay. Well, the performances of yours that I've seen and heard, I distinctly see elements that resemble some of the ideas that your father demonstrated during performances, such as humor, interaction, facial expressions, fun. The Brubecks have fun when they play. So what are some of the ideas that you cherish most that you feel like you learned from your dad?
Well, one thing is just, pure integrity and sticking to your vision. And, when my dad first started doing his music, he literally was turned down by every record company saying, what is this? Yeah. And
that's amazing.
Yeah. And he had to start his own record company to get a record out. And what he started is a famous record company called Fantasy Records.
Oh, really? I didn't know that was him.
That was him, because he knew 2 cats whose dad ran a record pressing plant. And so they said on the slide, well, we'll print the records like between 3 and 5 in the morning. And my dad will hardly knew that we're using extra plastic. And so their original vinyl records were sometimes all red, sometimes calico. That was like sort of necessity of mother of invention, like what scrap was around. But but those fantasy records started getting good reviews in Downbeat and you know, the magazines like that. And then these same two business partners screwed my dad out of the company that he started, Fantasy Records.
Oh,
you know,
man.
It was like technical thing about language, like partners who had the rights to the name. So my dad was really lucky because once he was screwed out of his own record company and thinking, oh my God, my life has just disintegrated. It turned out that George Avakian, a famous record producer, along with the John Hammond kind of guy from Columbia, said, well, Dave, I've been digging your tunes and you may have just gotten screwed out of your own record company, but I want you to sign you to Columbia, which was the biggest jazz label with the best distribution on it. And so then Dave's recording career really took off in there. So sometimes, you know, you don't know it, but good advice to young players, getting screwed can be the best thing that happens.
Wow. That is some great history, man. I never knew that, you know. And you're right. Those experiences with, you know, record companies, sometimes they turn out for the better. You know, when you get dropped by the one, you get picked up by somebody better, you know.
Yeah.
So, all right. So the concept of musical meter, let's talk about that a little bit, because obviously that's one of the biggest concepts that you guys grew up hearing. You know, the changes of meter, playing in 5, playing in 7 and 6 and everything else. Are there other musical concepts that you hope to explore in your musical compositions as you move forward? Like, is there anything that you're like, we got to get to I want to do this project or, you know, dealing with this concept or that concept? Or is it just, how are you seeing that?
Well, the things that I inherited that are important to me is like Dave's concept, which a lot of it came from the French composer Darius Milhaud, but the idea of polytonality as being really interesting, and I really like that. And you know, as you probably know, a lot of modern classical music can be really out there tonally. It's like colors of all crazy stuff, and you can't even tell what key it's in. And
that's right.
Basically, I kind of organically don't gravitate to that direction. But when it comes to rhythm, for example, I wrote a piece, it was a concerto for orchestra called Convergence. And I wanted to put it in 7 on one of the movements, because I just find things that are in 4, they get stuck in a series of rectangles. You know, and of course, most of the music we love is in 4, but I'm saying there's something about putting it in 7 where it gets, you know, by the 7th beat you get slingshot into the next bar. You don't get trapped in a corner.
It's perpetual.
You're always getting flung ahead. And so of course I learned that concept from hearing compositions like on Dave's Timeout, you know, 3 to get ready and 4 to go, all alternating 3 and 4, or Unsquare Dance was famously in 7. But it was funny because like on the recording of Unsquare Dance, you can hear the original group. It was actually just the trio. It was Dave and Joe Murillo and Gene Wright. You can hear them laughing at the end. They're laughing because they managed to get through it. They never played that tune live. But when me and my brother started playing with Dave, we said, you know, that tune, that's pretty cool, Unsquare Dance. And so we started making it, you know, like a funky version of that. And my brother Dan is just like, you know, it's amazing what he can do when he plays like a drum solo, like take 5 and 5, what he superimposes over everything. And it was weird about, I don't know how long ago it was, maybe about 20 years ago, we started playing take 5 instead of your standard dun, 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 dun. We started taking it like a second line thing. It's like, you know, and
I like that.
The first time we ever played it that way, oddly enough, was at the Montreal Jazz Festival with Dave, Jerry Mulligan, and Dan and me. And
Oh,
Jerry, Jerry it was a real, you never know exactly what you're going to get from Jerry. Super intelligent cat, great musician. Sometimes he just really busts you. And other times, and we walked off the stage, he said, Dan and I still remember, like, where have you guys been all my life? I love that groove. So I would think that Jerry would love it so much, but that's how we always approach it. And then I love it, Dan takes it that direction. Sometimes the band, like, we get really funky on it. And I remember we played the Detroit Jazz Festival, and some of these cats from other bands came up and said, man, that was like some really greasy funk on that. I felt like, yeah, man. So that's how we use the Dave tunes. Well, we've tried not to play Take 5, and people are just bugged with us, so we do it. And we have a good time.
Oh, I love that, man. And I mean, I have to say myself, man, when I first heard the Brubecks, your dad, and doing those tunes, I mean, it was like the best of everything. It was like the best of artwork on the cover. It was like the best of music. It was the best of grooves. I mean, it was just so compelling, And I think that's one of the things our listeners are going to be kind of excited about on October 2nd. We're going to segue to, I think Julia is going to, Julia, do you have any questions for us? We're going to welcome
we do. We've got such jazz fans out there. We got questions on both Zoom and on Facebook. And I just want to remind everybody, type your questions in now. This is your chance to those dying questions you have for the Brubecks and for Dr. Todd as well. So here's one from Kirsten in Panama. And she says, how do you want to honor your father's jazz legacy? And how does that also apply to your musical legacy?
Okay, well, just by playing his music is one of the big honors. And there's several people around the world that really wanted to remind everyone that our dad's centennial year was this year, including Carmel. But sadly, because of COVID, we lost a big performance at the Hollywood Bowl and at Royal Albert Hall in London.
Oh, wow.
Over 100 gigs that were planned were lost.
Big venues, yeah.
Yeah, and on top of that, one of the things that we did do in the honoring Dave thing was play at Ronnie Scott's for a week in London, and very sadly, my brother Dan and my brother Darius both got COVID very badly, and almost died from it. So, but they're back and they're playing, and it's a real triumph of spirit and willpower to come out of the whole thing with ventilators and medically induced coma and all that kind of thing. And so when I don't announce it from stage, but when people hear Dan and their jaws are on the floor, I want to add, and besides, he was almost dead. It's like Lazarus on the drums. But another way that we honor Dave is actually a record that we put out. You were talking about, Todd, how much you were impressed by the Dave Brubeck Quartet and the artwork and everything. Two people wrote books about Dave in honor of his centennial, and both of those authors said, hey, Chris, and Dan and Darius, we discovered something weird. Did you guys know there were outtakes from the Time Out sessions? And I said, actually, I never thought of it. I didn't know there were any. So we got access to those files, and we started a family record company, and we put out a record last year called Time Outtakes. And so it's all different versions of the tunes that you never heard before. And they're certainly not, quote unquote, worse than the ones that were on the record. Some of them are better, but it would be like, for example, Blue Rondo a la Turk. Dave was really digging in, and you can hear him grunting like Earl Garner, and he played 10 choruses on the blues. And Gio Macero, who was also Miles Davis' producer, probably said, Dave, we only got 18 minutes aside, you can't play that long.
Right.
So they threw that take out. Doesn't mean it wasn't any better.
That's right. That's right.
So, and Paul Desmond, played the most beautiful, lyrical, stunning solo on Kathy's Waltz, and that take they didn't use. I mean, it was just incredible. Wow. So, anyhow, we put that record out. It's got fabulous reviews. It got a lot of jazz airplay. So that's one way we honored his legacy by showing people how fresh his music is with that. And and also we're doing a show in Carmel that has video content too. because when people like you would ask, like, well, what was it like growing up in the Brubeck family? Well, we while we're playing a tune like Kathy's Waltz, we'll show pictures of my sister Kathy when she was 5 and inspired that tune. And you see the family, at different ages crawling around playing instruments and et cetera, et cetera. So that's a big thing. We get to honor our mom, who I talked about briefly, like by doing a song "In Your Own Sweet Way," which is a jazz standard and was dedicated to my mom. And Miles Davis heard it and he recorded it on his next record. So that was like, that was really cool. And by the way, Miles Davis also, my dad was the first guy to do a record that was based on Disney tunes. Because when we were little kids, he'd come home at 3 a.m. and my mom would say, like, don't make any noise in the morning. And we had these little record players we'd have Disney recordings on. So Dave was trying to sleep and he's dreaming and he's hearing Alice in Wonderland. This will come, give a little whistle. And he did this record called Dave Digs Disney. And it really took off. And, so Miles's next record was called Someday My Prince Will Come.
Oh, man.
So
wow.
There's all these cross influences, from different things you discover in different ways. I mean, that's what music is all about, all these strange interconnections.
That's right.
And the creativity to put them together.
Oh, yeah. So many different connections, with people and places. And I was thinking how the jazz world, it's not a big world, you know what I mean? Like people say, well, how do you know this person? How do you know that person? And I tell my students, I'll be playing examples. And I said, well, I play with that person. So you must be really old.
Well, speaking of people you play with, I got to say, after my father died, the sweetest thing in the world was that Wynton Marsalis had just flown back from somewhere in Europe, I think France, landed at JFK, came backstage at St. John the Divine, rehearsed a tune with me and my brother Dan and a great pianist named Andy Laverne. And it was a tune Dave wrote called For Iola, and Branford played soprano on it. And it was one of the best times I've ever heard that tune played. And, fresh off the plane, backstage for, 20 musicians sitting around. I mean, so many musicians came out to play for that, Chick Corea, Bill Charlap and Rennie Rosnes. And it was a great outpouring. And I want to say also that the man you worked with so many years, Wynton Marsalis, like I'm a little bit older than him. And I remember when he first hit the jazz scene, we're talking about this kid, Marsalis can really play. And we were in a jazz festival in Nice, France, called the Grand Parade du Jazz. And there was an Olive Garden stage, set in a grove. And I couldn't see who was playing. And I heard these two cats doing this amazing trumpet battle. Like one cat was like, up there screeching. And I thought, well, maybe that's John Faddis, Another cat was playing down below. And I said, I don't know, is that Freddie Hubbard or whatever? Yeah. And I got up close enough and son of a bitch, it was Wynton just pretending he was two people. Trading with himself. So that's the first time I ever heard Wynton. And we've been very friendly ever since. And he's always shown the utmost respect.
That's right.
And that even ties back to the opening of Jazz at Lincoln Center. My brother Darius ended up writing a piece that it was all had to do with narration about freedom. Each piece had a narrator. Morgan Freeman narrated a piece that Darius wrote with a former student of his from South Africa about Nelson Mandela, based on his words. And so the families are really interconnected through the art.
Oh, yeah. That's fantastic. Julia?
Yeah. And let me just say that Kristen wants to say thank you, Chris, for that, because she actually grew up in Wilton, Connecticut. She says about 5 minutes from your family home, and your dad went to her church.
Wow.
So there's a personal connection now. Now, I've got one more question here. This one's on Facebook. This one's from Doug. And he says, could you please comment? Now, you've talked a little bit about your mom throughout this, but he wants a little bit more. Could you please comment on the role your mother Lola had in helping to launch your father's career in the early 1950s? Also, could you touch upon your mother's role in collaborating with your father as the lyricist for a number of songs and large-scale choral works that he wrote?
Yeah, so my mom, and it's confusing because when it gets written in the popular font of all computers, it looks like Lola, but it's really Iola.
Sorry.
Yes, that's okay. It happens all the time. She wrote lyrics to many of Dave's tunes, and they collaborated on a musical they wrote together called The Real Ambassadors, about the jazz outreach programs in the 1958 that Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington and Dizzy Gillespie were doing. And when it came to my father writing large-scale religious works, she was very involved in helping him select biblical texts, which version, which translation, which exact word from whose gospel, is it the Greek version or the St. James or the, King James? It's just all different. So she was very involved in that. And as I mentioned earlier before, the whole idea of getting his career going as a manager who just didn't want him to come home smelling like smoke every night, And my dad didn't smoke, but, and he was one of the first guys when the Blue Note wanted him to play in the club. He said, I'm not going to play there unless you have a no smoking policy, which a lot of people interpreted that as arrogance, but it was just some self-survival and trailblazing, by accident.
Oh yeah. Wow. that was earth-shaking during those days, I'm sure,
Yeah. Well, the club owners, they used to actually turn off the ventilation system and the air conditioning for the first show. Yeah. So when the first set was over, people would be like dying and choking, like, let me out of this club. And then they leave quicker so they could turn over the house. And they'd let it be a little easier on the second set,
I thought maybe they were trying to sell more alcohol.
Absolutely. I can't breathe, please, another beer. And we just witnessed the passing of one of the musical giants of the industry, George Wein.
Yeah, that's right.
Who started the Newport Jazz Festival.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
But my dad and him go back so far that when my mom was first doing the how do you promote a jazz college thing, Dave would drive with the quartet all the way across America, get to Boston, and George Wein, they'd get the cafeteria at some college, and they'd tear all the tables down, set up chairs. He'd be taking a buck at the door to go watch the Dave Brubeck Quartet. I mean, completely grassroots of all that. And then also Dave was right there in the beginning with Jimmy Lyons starting the Monterey Jazz Festival. When he was trying to get permission to have the festival in Monterey, the city father said, well, what is this jazz? What kind of music is this? And Jimmy asked Dave to come down and play the lousy old upright in the town hall to give him an example of what kind of jazz. So Dave had a foot in both the Monterey and the Newport, and probably, I think, has a record for the most performances in both of those over the decades.
Remarkable. There's so much history there, man. I mean, if you got to talking about George Wein even more, I mean, you could just talk all night.
Yeah. Yeah, so, he and Joyce, his wife, a real giant. And I remember being totally struck by the economics. I remember hearing that when the Newport, after the riots, which I was at in Newport, and it moved into the city called the JVC Festival, I remember him saying, if we sold out every show 100%, we would lose money. That's what the economics are like. You have to have a sponsor that gives you a big nut in exchange for advertising. And that's how jazz is going to survive. So he did what he had to do. He figured it out. I'd still be there figuring out how come my wallet's empty, even though I had all these sellouts.
It's a jazz tradition, man.
and then Joyce and him, they figured out to bring, because the New Orleans culture, is sort of related to French culture. And when we were playing the Grand Prix du Jazz in Nice every year, which the French people love, she started bringing all these cooks over from New Orleans to cook up big piles of gumbo and make it a dining experience out there.
Oh yeah.
As well. So anyhow, they just really did the great thing for the rest of the world. And it was so cool that LL Cool said, talking about George when he got a special Grammy award, for lifetime achievement, said, there would have been no Woodstock, no, Lollapalooza, or whatever these festivals are called. Bonnaroo. Right. George had the vision to get it going.
Wow.
Even rock and roll would be everyone for him. On that scale.
That's right.
Amen, George. R.I.P.
All right, Julia.
Yeah, Chris and Todd, I think we're going to wrap it up now. We want to be respectful of your time. Chris, I know you've got a really busy schedule. As I mentioned at the beginning of the program, Chris's tour just started last Friday, I believe, in New York, and now he's in California, joining us from his hotel room. And it has just been a delight to hear your stories and the stories of your family. And we are thrilled that you will be at the Palladium on October 2nd. So we hope everybody out there gets a chance to come see us. And we hope that you will join us for our next Jazz Talk. We will hopefully have these a couple weeks prior to each of our jazz performances in our series. And we are thrilled that Dr. Todd Williams will be hosting all of them this year. And Todd, I think you've got Wynton lined up for one. And
That's right.
keep an eye on our website for those dates and times. And thank you both for joining us, and thank all of you for joining us tonight. And we hope to see you very soon at the Center for the Performing Arts. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you. We're looking forward to playing for y'all.
Thank you, Chris.
Anytime.
Bye, everybody. We'll be in touch.